and tax collection. I think we are just in the earliest stages as a field in beginning to appreciate the potential for these same tools of behavioral science to help us make progress in areas related to crime and criminal justice and reduction of drug abuse. And we're starting to see the opportunities, but we're also starting to learn more about the potential challenges that need to be overcome in order to realize those opportunities, including getting the right data infrastructure in place to capitalize on the tools of behavioral science in this domain. I could hardly imagine a more outstanding panel to help us think through these issues. As I said, it's very humbling for me to be part of this and moderate the discussion. We're going to have 4 presentations by 4 speakers providing us with different perspectives from different places around the world on these issues, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. I'll be monitoring the chat if you have questions. Everyone has their bios, so I'll just keep their introductions very brief. The first speaker is Edward Bradon. I hope I got your last name correct, Edward. Who's the director of the Behavioral Insights team's Home Affairs, Security, and International Development Practice. I assume patching in from London. Edward, terrific to have you here today. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens, for that introduction. And yeah, great pleasure to be here. Let me just put up my slides and then see if we can get going. Are those coming up? I can see some nodding from Aurelie. Very good. Well, as I say, delighted to be here. My name's Ed Bradon. I'm the director of Home Affairs, and I guess most relevantly for this group, the Behavioural Insights team's work in crime and justice. I want to talk today a little bit about some of the kind of practical challenges when it comes to using data for behavioural science, I guess particularly in a kind of government and policing context. Rather than to talk about that in abstract, what I thought I would do is run through an actual trial that we've recently had the results from New Zealand. And as I go through, I'm going to try and just highlight some of the kind of practical data challenges that we've encountered, and maybe try and draw some lessons. If I've got time, I will sneak in a second UK trial, but I think the precise timekeeping will mean I'm going to just stick with one today. So the trial I want to talk to you about to, I guess, illustrate some of these themes around the challenges of using data in this context is one about improving bail compliance, so compliance with people's bail conditions. And I'll talk in a second about the specific type that we're interested in. And this is in New Zealand with the New Zealand police. Before I go any further, I just want to give a quick shout out to some of the inspiration for this project, which is Aurelie's, who's going to be speaking a little bit later, fantastic paper on a similar question. I'm not going to say anything about that paper in case that's the topic of what Aurelie will be speaking to us later about, but just wanted to acknowledge that I guess one of the great things about this field and trying to use this data in this way is that you've got this kind of community, and we've got many of those people on the call today. So just wanted to make sure I highlight that before I go any further. So what sort of bail compliance do we care about? What's the challenge that we're looking at here? Well, in New Zealand and in many jurisdictions, what happens when you get arrested is that in most cases you get released on bail, and you get released on bail on the condition that you meet certain conditions. And the most important of these is that you show up to court on your appointed date. Pretty straightforward. But in reality, a lot of people don't show up when they're supposed to. So in New Zealand, in the time period we were looking at, about 14 or 15% of people do not show up in court. And this is a huge problem for the system, because it's very expensive to send out officers to go and issue arrest warrants. It takes up a lot of time in the courts, but it's also very bad for the individual. Individual outcomes are generally worse. You can be facing more prison time and in general, worse experience of the criminal justice system as a result of not turning up. And so the sort of first kind of data question for us was really a qualitative rather than a quantitative data question, which was trying to understand, well, why is it that given these bad outcomes, but people are just failing to turn up. And there's lots of different sort of hypotheses going around in the system. We set up a sort of hotline for when in the nearest police station to our office in Wellington, when somebody was about to be released on bail, a hotline so that they could call us and we could send over one of our team to rush over and go and interview the person and try and understand that process a little bit. And also we can see on the right, one of the sobering cells, we had one of our team go and spend the night in there to really experience the system. And quite a simple thing came back from a lot of this qualitative research. Obviously, there's huge complexity in all the different factors that are driving these behaviors, but a common thing that was happening was just that people were not understanding or were forgetting that they had to go to court on this date. So anybody who works in behavioral science will know that's the kind of situation where kind of a bad consequence with quite a minor oversight, where looking at small nudges and reminders is something we get quite excited about. And in this case, we found a very simple point in the process to intervene, which was just when you leave custody, you get given and actually often read out to you this piece of paper which explains, well, here are the things you've got to do. And as, again, nobody on this call will be surprised by, in the previous version, that was hardly an optimized document. You probably can't see quite the detail here, but this is on the left-hand side, the old version. It's not as covered in text as some of these, but had a very high reading age. You needed to have a sort of high school level education to understand all the words on here. It didn't really explain very clearly what it was doing. So notice of a police bail, you may not know what that means. If you're an insider, you certainly do, but to somebody who's not familiar with the system, that's kind of confusing. And all of the information is on there. It's quite well hidden. So we did a very classic, simple nudge change. And again, Aurelie, your work was a big inspiration for us in this, as well as other things we've done in criminal justice. So we just try to make it a lot easier for somebody getting this piece of paper to know what they've got to do. So at the top there, you can see in big red writing, you must go to court. It's pretty obvious again, but all of those elements make a difference. We did a few more things in terms of simplifying the language. So we took it down to like a 9 years old reading age from a sort of 14, 15-year-old reading age. We included a couple of sort of, and we don't really know how well these worked, but sort of small nudges in terms of reminding everybody, look, by the way, most people actually do go to court. If you don't, you'll be one of the few that doesn't. And sort of making explicit the kind of reciprocity arrangement. And again, behavioral scientists love this idea of reciprocity, that if somebody does something for you, you are encouraged, you feel an urge to do something for them. We just reminded people that, look, well, by the way, look, we're releasing you on bail. The quid pro quo for that, the sort of the reciprocity there is you've then got to turn up in court. So just reminding people of that. So nothing super clever here. And I don't want to dwell too long on the intervention. But we kind of got this new design, and here was the next piece of data that we wanted to get hold of, which is, well, we think this makes more sense. We'd shown it to some of the people in the system and some of the defendants, and they'd said, yeah, this looks good. It looks simpler. But what we really cared about was, does this actually make any difference to the proportion of people who fail to turn up in court? And if it doesn't make any difference, I mean, it's a nice to have, but that's not really accomplishing what we needed to do. So we had this big, hard process of figuring out, well, we want to run an experiment. We want to see, compare on the one hand the old version, and on the other hand the new version, and sort of randomly allocate the groups to see that. And in some cases, we would be able to just choose individuals to say, okay, you get the old one and you get the new one. We ended up partnering with 6 separate police stations across New Zealand. So you can see there, those of you who've got good New Zealand geography can know which cities these are in. I won't go through that. And what we ended up having to do with 6, obviously, if we just randomize and we just have, okay, one of the 6 gets the new version, another of the 6 gets the old version, that's a very small number of different sites, and doesn't give us a lot of ability to say, well, we know the difference was because of our new version, rather than the difference between, oh, just this police station is doing better than this other one. But we also couldn't do it individually. So what we ended up doing was working with the individual custody officers themselves and training half of them, randomly chosen, in doing the new version, and half of them just keeping on doing the old version, and then sort of checking that the groups between them were similar. And this let us do the trial. I'll show you the results in a second. But is one of the places where the challenges of doing experiments and the kind of data challenges of behavioral science in criminal justice really came in, which was the systems that we were working in New Zealand were not really at all set up with anybody running experiments on them in mind. They were basically there to be, here's how we do it, and this is always going to be the way. And so for our new version that we wanted to change, we didn't want to just sort of flip the system over and have that go everywhere at once, because we didn't know if it worked yet. So we kept the old system, and we had to basically ask these officers that we were training to do this manual workaround, where basically you have to manually upload this new version. And it's not difficult, it's perfectly doable, but it's a few extra steps in that process. And we found in doing this, most of the officers were fantastic and got it perfectly right. We found when we're checking our data later on, something that's very, very common in these situations when you're relying on a human step to implement your new version of something, which was that actually a number of the officers didn't do the new version, and they just kept to the old version, and that for perfectly reasonable reasons, in that it was a bit longer, took a bit more time to do the new version. If you're stressed and you've just got to rush somebody out, you don't do it. But we had to then like pick that up and find the officers that hadn't done that, and then strip that out of our data afterwards. I'll just show you the results of this, which were, I think we feel comfortable with saying that we probably, but not certainly, did increase court attendance by 4 percentage points. So our sort of, our trial was significant at the 10% level rather than the 5% level, which the statisticians among you will be familiar with as a painful threshold not to quite get under. But it's kind of encouraging initial data. So this suggests, 4 percentage points. And if you think about what does that mean actually in terms of people who aren't going, if that effect kind of held up, that would mean that would go in this sample from 16%, 15% of people who don't show up to only kind of 12%. So quite a significant, not huge, but a significant cut from what's a really very straightforward nudge, and once it's implemented, from something which shouldn't take kind of long-term extra resource and extra time doing it. It should just be, here's a simpler version, we can turn that on, and now that's the way we do it. And so we're working at the moment with New Zealand Police to see if we can roll this up, roll this out, and then see if actually as we do that, we can do a further experiment to check that this was not a fluke and that it really is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And a check for us, you can see on the right there, it's a bit of I'm afraid it's a small detailed chart. The left-hand side is just proportion of people attending court. The right-hand side was us just trying to track this over time. And the dotted lines you can see vertically are when the new police stations kind of start using this new system. And we broadly see that before they all start using it, the sort of blue and the black lines track each other pretty closely, which sort of suggests that our two groups of the ones that get it and the ones that don't are pretty similar in their characteristics. And then we see a small but kind of visible on the chart divergence with the blue line sort of going up, which means more people getting the treatment, the new version are attending court, which is kind of what we want to see, and a useful just visual check for us on the data that we're not being misled by something weird going on, which does often happen. And I'll just close by just talking about one last source of data. So we started out with the kind of the qualitative data gathering, which we were doing ourselves, going into the police stations, talking to lots of people, trying to understand, what should we be actually targeting, and figuring out, actually, people are forgetting, we can do something there. And then we had the kind of quantitative data in the middle, trying to really say, okay, does this change behavior in a measurable way? But the last kind of piece of our sort of qual sandwich is then when it sort of did seem to work in the numbers, following up with the humans and the people involved in the system and just talking to them again. And we did a combination of interviews and a survey to try and understand, I guess, two things. Like one was just sort of saying, well, is there any more? It seems to have worked. Is there any more we can learn about why it worked, which might be helpful for us in making it better, even better in the future? And also to understand whether there were any kind of backfire effect or other things going on. So quite a common thing that you see is that, like, yes, we've chosen our very narrow number that we're going to try and improve, but in the process of improving this one number, there's other things that are going on, which might be as simple as just we've annoyed a lot of bail officers and made their jobs harder, or it might be more sort of systematic things like, yes, people are sort of showing up to bail, but there are other conditions that they're breaching as a result, or the reoffending rate has got worse somehow, and all of these sort of effects that we want to pick up, and we can't necessarily tell quantitatively, but we might see the kind of smoking gun if we ask somebody and they just tell us. And again, in this case, it was a broadly kind of positive story. We heard that actually one of the reasons perhaps why it was working better and why staff liked it was that often the interaction when you get this piece of paper is not just that you kind of get handed to it and it just goes in your back pocket and you leave. There's actually this interaction where the officer sits down and literally reads word for word everything that's been written on this piece of paper and checks you understand it. So therefore, if you've got a new version of it, which is a bit more human language and something that can be explained a bit more clearly, and that it doesn't just sound like somebody reading legalese, which you're then just going to switch off and not listen to, that improves the interaction. We also found a couple of interesting things which bear on the question of, well, how do we scale this up and how do we keep working on it? And I'll just sort of call out, I guess, the interesting comment at the bottom right on this slide, which was this slight pushback, which again we see in a few contexts, which was that yes, you've made it easier, and maybe that's even worked, but you've made it too easy almost. It's been this delightful phrase, created for idiots, which I think is maybe a good objective for us all to keep in mind. I certainly appreciate when I'm interacting with a government system that has been created for idiots like me. But this kind of this slight resistance and actually sort of thinking, well, it's a sort of bit of a defeatist attitude, and like, is this really going to make a difference? These people aren't going to change, and kind of forget about it, which doesn't necessarily sort of cause us to rethink whether we should have done this intervention or why it worked. But if we're now in a space of, well, we've done this with 6, but we're going to go up to 30 or 50 different police stations, or with different cultures and different dynamics going on, it's really important to understand these kind of qualitative objections in the system as well. This is just equally valid data, because that, just as much as something not working, can kind of torpedo your intervention. And with that, I think I will pause there and maybe save the second example for later on, because I think otherwise I will start to eat into others' time. But looking forward to the discussion later on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Edward. Thanks for staying on time. Terrific presentation. It is my pleasure next to introduce the second panelist, who's also, as Edward just mentioned, one of the leaders in using behavioral science in this broad area. Aurelie Ouss is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Pennsylvania. And Aurelie, let me go ahead and turn it over to you next then. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a similar topic to Ed's. I am going to talk about the study that he started telling you about. But before I jump into telling you about bail itself, I wanted to take a little bit of a step back and describe how I think a lot of policymakers have been thinking about criminal justice policy, which is to really focus on deterrence. So what does this mean? Well, a lot of our policies are meant to make crime not attractive for people. So for example, we have longer prison sentences. We may be using monetary sanctions such as fines or fees, or we may be increasing the number of police officers who are around in order to make the probability that a person would be caught if they do something wrong bigger. So these kinds of policies only work if people who are deciding whether they should or they shouldn't commit a crime are actually taking into account the consequences of their actions in that moment. And so I think where behavioral science can be helpful is that in lots of different domains, which Jens talked about in his introduction, such as health, savings, municipal finance, policymakers have realized that people aren't always considering the costs and benefits of their actions. And so this can both explain why some policies backfire and or open the way for some policies that can address particular behavioral biases. So like Ed, I'm going to talk about failing to appear in court. Ed already described why this is a problem, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the context, like what penalties exist. What do we currently have in place in order to make sure that people show up to court, at least in the United States? First of all, if a person doesn't show up to court, they will get an arrest warrant. So this is typical deterrence. I'm threatening you of being arrested if you don't show up to court. Second, a really used tool, at least in the United States, is cash bail. You're released from prison, you post some money, and if you do not show up to court, you'll lose this large amount of money. So this is really similar to other kinds of crimes. Failures to appear are addressed in the same ways. And yet failure to appear rates are very high, higher it seems like than in New Zealand. For felonies, 21 to 24% of people don't show up to at least one court date. And pretrial detention is very common. Why are these two things related? Well, kind of the sledgehammer way for people to show up to court is to have them be in jail pretrial. And this is both very costly to the system, but also, and perhaps especially for people who are have not been convicted yet and are in jail pretrial. In a lot of places, the judges in the United States are just supposed to take into account the risk that a person may not show up to court. So what we did in this project, which Ed foreshadowed, is that we tested two behaviorally informed policies. If the reason why people aren't showing up to court is not because the threat isn't big enough, they don't care about being arrested, they don't care about the money they'll lose if they don't show up to court, but simply because of inattention, then other policies that directly address inattention would be effective. So one is very similar to what Ed just told you about, which is helping make it easier for people to remember their court dates. And the second one is sending people text messages. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through the results of this study so that I can spend some more time saying what we learned from this policy around, what I think are barriers to possibly scaling these policies elsewhere. So both policies were very effective. The form redesign, we found reduced failures to appear by about 13%, which seems similar as I was calculating to what you find. Basically, the changes were very similar to what Ed described. We labeled the ticket as a court appearance ticket. We moved the date up, the time up, and highlighted the consequences of not showing up to court. So that was our first intervention. So second, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, although I'm sure this is very obvious to everyone in the room, we simply send people text message reminders. And what we did is that we tested different kinds of text messages. I should say this study was done in New York City, and the context in which we were working was the lowest level of criminal offenses. These were things like having an open container, being in a park after dark, public urination. So these were really the lowest level types of criminal offenses. And the reason why we started at this level is that when we started this project back in 2015, there had not been a lot of tests of behavioral interventions in the criminal justice space. And so our partners, the New York Police Department, the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and the New York Department, the Office of Court Administration of the state of New York, all were willing to partner with us and try this work, but they wanted to try to start at a lower level and with lower level offenses. And so these text messages were sent not by the researchers, but by the courts themselves. And the way we studied that is we used a randomized controlled trial. The New York courts were sending the text messages, but we worked with them to randomize. Some people did not get a reminder, and some people got different kinds of reminders. And so the kinds of reminders people got were 1 week, 3 days, and the day before their court appearance. And here you can see an example of a text message, helpful reminder, go to court, we'll text you to help remember, show up to avoid an arrest warrant. And these messages were extremely effective. So right now I told you the good news, which is we tested 2 interventions and both worked really well to reduce failures to appear, at least in this context in New York City. I do want to talk about what I think are possible barriers to scaling nudges. So, this again, here we found that policies addressing inattention were very effective. And by contrast, in another study with Megan Stevenson, I found that the most frequent policy in the United States, which is monetary bail, does not reduce failures to appear. So when we think we're not designing the right policies, which is increasing the cost of non-attendance, because we're assuming that people are making this calculation and don't want to lose money. And so this is what this first study shows. And then the second study that I went more in depth with you, when with Nusha and Alyssa Fishbane, we addressed inattention that was really effective. So why aren't nudges more frequently used in crime policy? I want to go through 2 kinds of barriers. One are psychological barriers, and the other are data infrastructure barriers. So what do I mean by psychological barriers, and how did we test this? We ran some online experiments to figure out how lay people thought about failing in the criminal justice sphere. So we asked people how intentional criminal justice failures are, and we compared that to the other domains in which nudges are more common, again, health, saving, and then we asked them whether they supported nudges for criminal justice failures. So we gave them vignettes. A person was supposed to show up to court, they didn't. Did they do it on purpose or not? Versus a person had a doctor's appointment, They didn't show up to court. Was this on purpose or not? And do you support nudges for these behaviors? And so what we find is that lay people think that criminal justice failures are more intentional than other and are less likely to support nudges. And so, we replicated this with professionals, judges, prosecutors. They're more cognizant of behavioral biases. But if lay people are electing decision makers, then it's important for them, to start to recognize that the same things that make it hard for us to, perhaps pay our bills on time or show up to all the appointments we have, the same things may be at play in criminal justice as well. So, just last within these psychological studies, we did find that, a simple intervention, which is encouraging people to write down a reason why a person may have not on purpose not shown up to court. So they wrote things like maybe they had, a transportation conflict, maybe they just forgot. Then they were more likely to support nudges. So I think this is a good lesson as we're thinking of scaling this up. So now I wanted to spend some time thinking about what we would need in order to expand nudges, and especially to make sure that we expand them in an equitable manner. So first, I do want to acknowledge that we were extraordinarily lucky in our partnership with NYPD, the New York Court Administration, and the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in New York City. They were willing to work with researchers to entertain this idea and test things with us. But I do want to highlight a few limitations of this study. The first one is that only 13% of people provided phone numbers. And what's more is that there were racial disparities in providing phone numbers to police officers, and in neighborhoods that had a higher percentage of residents who are Black or Hispanic, people for reasons that we can't really study, but were less willing to provide their phone numbers to police officers, perhaps because of bad interactions with police officers. Perhaps they were worried about how their contact information was being used. So this is something that I think we'll need to think about. A lot of the reminders interventions have in common that you need to be able to contact people. And so helping increase this contact level will be important. So then the second point is really thinking hard about the infrastructures to send reminders. So I said that currently the courts were sending text messages, but there are reasons why you may think that these are not the best people to send reminders. People may not trust courts. Maybe they would be more willing to respond to it if it's their attorney who's sending them text messages. And there are also questions about who should receive the text message. Is it the defendant themselves? What if they don't have a phone number? What if they don't have a reliable phone number? Should we expand this to family members? All these questions I think will be important to successfully scale these up. And so getting the infrastructure right, hopefully will help expand the scope and the equity of these kinds of approaches. So I also wanted to think about expanding the scope for nudges. So if we want to design, what we did was super simple. We were just addressing one thing, which is inattention, but there could be other barriers to compliance. So I think Ed's work is really terrific, like trying to gather qualitative information is really great in order to understand what are other barriers that could happen. And I think one particular point where this could be done is during a person's pretrial interview. Understanding the specific needs that a person has means that imagine you had a portfolio of possible things, to not have to give them everything, which could be overwhelming. You could design particular interventions to their particular needs. And second, I do want to, another thing that's important that was also one of Ed's comments towards the end is that understanding the effectiveness of nudges in criminal justice requires capturing data on other things than what is currently available in administrative data. So we looked just at pretrial failures to appear in courts, and this is great. And other studies can have looked at pretrial attendance and also pretrial crime. But there are other dimensions that may be important to capture. For example, did the perceptions of the courts change in a good way because they think the court has their back and is helping them comply, or in a bad way, they think it's creepy that they're getting text messages from the court? And then was there heterogeneity and effectiveness? These are all questions that I hope that both leveraging existing administrative data and working to collect new data will help us understand better. And before I hand it back over to you, Jens, I do want to say that I think nudges are clearly completely underutilized in the criminal justice. So it happens that Ed and I both talked about not showing up to court, but there are other places. For example, one of the big contributors to incarceration is people failing to comply to parole or probation conditions. And, perhaps this is another place where nudges can be helpful, but I do want to acknowledge that they won't be sufficient to address structural disparities within criminal justice, although again, a very helpful tool that I hope to see being used more widely. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Aurelie. That was great. It is my pleasure to introduce the third panelist. Next is Ouss Cheema, who is an associate professor of economics at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. And Ouss, let me turn it over to you. And thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much. It's a real privilege to be part of this panel on a really important question. I want to thank the UN and Jens for inviting me. So I'm going to sort of take a step back. We've heard two really rich presentations, which sort of base themselves on very kind of specific problems and how you can use behavioral science in terms of sort of addressing those specific problems and provide evidence that can tell us whether the approaches can be scaled up or not. The kind of step back that I'm going to take is that, if I look at developing country context, I'm based in Pakistan, but this is happening in a number of places. You have a tendency now of a lot of governments setting up nudge units, including around sort of criminal justice activities. And typically these units base themselves on official data. Right, and that's because a lot of these countries are now automating data, digitizing data, and there's kind of better capture of information about people accessing the criminal justice system or being apprehended by the criminal justice system. What I'm going to talk about is basically while this approach offers a lot of opportunities, it also has serious limitations in terms of who can access the nudges that are being given. So my talk is less going to be about the importance of nudges and the contribution they can make. I'm going to take that as a given, but really talk about how nudge units can, in fact, create these structural inequalities in who receives the nudges. But I'm also going to talk about sort of the opportunity that we can leverage through new investments in data that are being made. So most of my talk is going to be about Pakistan, but has a very clear implication for South Asia because our criminal justice system is very similar to the system in India and Bangladesh. So these two graphs, the right kind of graph, basically shows you the official crime rate in 4 cities, which are London, the urban US, Delhi and Lahore. Lahore is in Pakistan, Delhi is in India. And this is just kind of the official rate coming from officially reported statistics. And on the left-hand side, basically what you see is the victimization rate that comes through crime victimization surveys that are done in these 4 different kind of contexts. Now, the interesting thing when we saw this was that if you look at the left-hand side picture, there aren't sort of huge differences in victimization rates. But if you look at the right-hand side picture, you see a huge difference in the reported crime rate. Now, why is this happening is the interesting point. In contexts like South Asia, what is recorded by official statistics are complaints registered by the police, not complaints made to the police. This is a kind of very subtle distinction, but it's based on a legal process. When a complaint comes, it's put through what is called a first information report. So an investigation officer is assigned. He actually goes out, in most cases it's a he, does an initial investigation, which is a filtering process to say, this complaint is worthy of being admitted to the criminal justice process or not. And what we can see is that this filtering process is resulting in massive underreporting of incidents, right? Now, this kind of becomes deeper when you not only think about the fact that some people are being denied access, but also that certain types may be getting more access than others, certain type of people. So this is kind of a graph which is looking at data from Lahore. This is called for service data, police's call for service data. And all it's showing you is the gender of the callers who call up. typically. And this is data for the past year. And as you can see, women are extremely unlikely to make calls, and the calls are hugely dominated by men. And does it matter? I mean, you could argue that, at least similar kinds of complaints are showing up. So we did an experimental study as part of EGAP's Metadata 4, which was on community policing in Pakistan. And we randomized sort of forums in communities. In some communities, you only got a general forum where anybody could come, which was typically dominated by men because there's huge gender inequality in access. And these were police-run forums. And in other communities, we had separate forums for men and women. What was interesting from this exercise is the kind of issues that showed up in in general or forums, which are typically dominated by men, like 99% of people there would be men, or in women-specific forums. So this is kind of a range of issues that came up in these forums. The light blue bars are basically bars that were reported in women-only forums, and the dark blue bars are for men. And as you can see, there are a number of issues that come up in women-only forums, particularly domestic and child abuse and eve-teasing, which don't really show up in male-dominated forums. And in fact, when you back this out and you actually look at reported crime data, which is based on the FIR, these are exactly the types of complaints that are not showing up. So you have overrepresentation of some concerns. So, this whole, what's being reported has huge biases linked to it. The third important thing that we learned from this community policing exercise and the work that we've been doing with the police is official data doesn't capture the diversity of forums used by citizens. So this is coming from a crime. This data is coming from a crime victimization survey, where once people said that they faced a particular victimization, we asked them what kind of forum would they like to go to. The vertical axis gives you the likelihood of people taking their complaint to an official forum. And then the sort of horizontal axis is showing you whether they would take it to an informal forum, which could be a community-based sort of dispute resolution mechanism, or a powerful guy sitting in a village. And as you can see, that there is a systematic differences in the type of forums that are used by certain types of complaints. So in the cases of murder and theft, the likelihood of going to the police is much higher. But when you come to issues of child custody, water disputes, financial matters, a lot of people go towards non-official forums. So if you just rely on official data, it's not just the type and the type of issues that get recorded, which are different, but actually, certain types of issues will completely fall out, and you don't see the dynamics between the informal and the formal forums that is taking place. So kind of my one big sort of, when I was preparing this presentation, I thought, how could we strengthen data infrastructure to address this question of equal access or better access or more equitable access to nudges, as it were. And I think it's clear to me that if you just rely on official data, you're going to really bias the problem. So what we need to do, kind of, which is just a base, is to start to capture data from complementary data sets. So in the South Asian context, what would be very important is to start capturing data from the complaints register, not just the data on registered crime, but also the data on the complaints that are received. Now, the pushback from the police is that most of this data is frivolous, but let that be captured and let sort of some subsequent analysis actually reveal what the degree of frivolity is around this data. I think it's also important to do community-based surveys in this domain and maybe embed nudges in that. The typical instrument researchers have been using our crime victimization surveys. In a lot of contexts in the North, these are pretty stable things that happen regularly, but in the South, these are much more sporadic. And I think the last kind of couple of points that I want to make is that building on what were the two presenters earlier, I think there's a lot of scope for micro-evaluation of agreed problems, and that's what they presented. And we also found, as part of these studies, we built in information and encouragement nudges, starting with just nudges to increase access to these official mechanisms. And for subpopulations, not for the general population, but for subpopulations, these nudges could have an important impact. But when we're doing those studies, it's not only about accessing non-official sources of data to complete the picture or to create a balanced sample, but also in those studies, at least in our context, what it's extremely important is to understand the general equilibrium effects, which are that, if you encourage somebody to take up the courts, what kind of effects happen on their use of informal forums. So we recently did this, I recently did this study with Daron Asimoglu, Asim Khaja, and Jim Robinson, where we just gave people information about a particular initiative that courts had taken, which was to sort of put some time durations on backlogs of cases and push these things through. And that really reduced backlogs. And this was kind of for a specific amount of time. When you went and gave this information to people, not only did they increase their use and their trust in the official system, but what happens is there's a negative spillover in expected use of the non-official systems, which could, in many cases, be challenging the legitimacy of the state. So to look at the landscape or the effects through the landscape is very important. My last point, and then I'll stop there, that there's a real opportunity, though, here with digitization that's happening. In the South now, you have calls for services that are coming in, complaint helplines that are coming in. And as long as we can broaden access and deal with the access problem, these helplines and these kind of interfaces allow a lot of kind of information-based nudges to be given with a lot of rich data on the type of people who are using. So using big data can offer a big sort of opportunity to scale up and make these interventions. But in doing that, we need to sort of strengthen the data infrastructure. So let me stop there.
Terrific. Thank you, Ellie. That was a wonderful compliment to the first two presentations. Terrific. And let me now introduce our fourth panelist, Daniel. I'm gonna Mejía. Did I get that?
Mejía, yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Who is an associate professor at the Department of Economics at the Universidad de los Andes and has had a number of very important government jobs as well. And it is a terrific pleasure and honor to have you here with us. And let me turn the floor over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks, Jens. I'm gonna do my presentation in English. I'm not gonna show slides in Spanish. Sorry, I'm gonna do my presentation in Spanish. So voy a hablarles. La presentación va a ser sobre la importancia de enlazar los datos y la información de los diferentes eslabones de la política criminal. Digamos, en la región de Latinoamérica ha habido muchos avances en varios países de tener buenas bases de datos en diferentes eslabones de la política criminal, pero hasta ahora, digamos, son muy pocos los avances en unir estas bases de datos para tener perfiles, digamos, o las hojas de vida criminales para tomar mejores decisiones en lo que tiene que ver con en cada eslabón de la cadena de política criminal. Entonces, por ejemplo, en la región tenemos para las contravenciones, lo que en inglés se conoce como los misdemeanors, tenemos el código de policía, que es una base de datos contravencional de quienes han, digamos, cometido contravenciones, que no son delitos, pero son comportamientos que van en contra de la convivencia. Tenemos de la policía muy buenas bases de datos de delitos, capturas, con mucha información sobre la hora en la que ocurre, el lugar exacto en el que ocurre el delito, el tipo de delito, las víctimas, con qué tipo de armas, si hubo violencia, etcétera. De investigación criminal tenemos toda la base de datos de investigaciones y actuaciones de los fiscales que llevan los casos para cada caso. Y en la judicatura, en el Consejo Superior de la Judicatura, hay una base de datos sobre decisiones judiciales, decisiones que toman no los fiscales, sino los jueces en cuanto a cada expediente. Y luego en el último eslabón tenemos toda la información que también es muy buena en muchos países de la región sobre el sistema carcelario, pero no había habido un esfuerzo antes de unir estas bases de datos para de alguna manera hacer un seguimiento histórico y digamos para la toma de decisiones actuales para conocer los perfiles criminales y las hojas de vida de las personas que han estado por lo menos alguna vez en alguno de los eslabones o en todos los eslabones de la política criminal. Entonces, yo estuve trabajando un año en la Fiscalía General de la Nación, en una unidad que es como el tablero de control de la Fiscalía General de la Nación en Colombia. Y una de las principales proyectos que logré sacar adelante fue construir una herramienta que denominamos Prisma, que son los perfiles de riesgo de reincidencia criminal para la solicitud de medidas de aseguramiento, que es básicamente enviar a prisión preventiva o a prisión domiciliaria a una persona que está entrando a etapa de juicio. La ley colombiana, que es la ley 906, que hizo la transición de un sistema penal inquisitivo a un sistema penal acusatorio mucho más garantista, establece que 3 causales por las cuales los fiscales pueden solicitar ante un juez de control de garantías la medida de aseguramiento, la prisión preventiva de una persona que ha sido capturado por la policía e imputado por la fiscalía de haber cometido un delito. Esas causales son el riesgo de no comparecencia, que fue al que hicieron referencia a Edward de Aurelie, el riesgo de afectar las pruebas, estos son especialmente para casos de corrupción, y la ley colombiana establece que si el fiscal o el juez de control de garantías ven un riesgo de seguridad para las víctimas o para la comunidad en general de reincidencia criminal, por el posible riesgo de reincidencia criminal, el fiscal puede solicitar ante el juez de control de garantías la medida de aseguramiento intramural o domiciliaria de la persona que está siendo imputada por la comisión de un delito, y esto tiene que pasar, digamos, de alguna manera la aprobación de un juez de control de garantías. Entonces es la ley, el Código Procesal Penal colombiano el que establece que esa tercera causal puede ser utilizada para enviar a una persona a prisión preventiva si hay un riesgo de reincidencia criminal. Pero como se estaban tomando las decisiones, ahora les cuento un poco sobre eso, es que básicamente los fiscales y los jueces de control de garantías tenían muy poca información sobre al momento de las audiencias sobre cuál era el riesgo objetivo de reincidencia criminal, y terminaba siendo una decisión basada única y exclusivamente en el delito por el cual estaba siendo procesada la persona, y no por su historial criminal ni por las proyecciones del riesgo de reincidencia criminal. Entonces, lo que hace esta herramienta básicamente es replicar un artículo con los datos colombianos, obviamente, y con algunos ajustes, un artículo que fue publicado en el 2019 en el Quarterly Journal of Economics, con muchísimos más datos, porque ese artículo fue publicado con datos para Nueva York, con muchísimos más datos porque cubre todo Colombia. Tenemos más o menos 8 millones de personas en la base de datos, y une todos los eslabones de la política criminal a nivel individual para construir no solo la hoja de vida criminal de las personas, cuántas veces ha sido capturada, por qué delitos, qué contravenciones ha cometido, qué procesos penales tiene activos en la fiscalía, qué decisiones han tomado los jueces, cuándo ha estado en el sistema carcelario, etcétera. Y hace una proyección utilizando herramientas de analítica de datos, en particular herramientas de Machine Learning, para proyectar o para predecir el riesgo de reincidencia criminal para cualquier delito, para delitos contra la propiedad, para delitos contra la vida y para otros delitos. Y de tal manera que cuando una persona es capturada por la policía y llevada ante un fiscal para ser procesado, el fiscal solo tiene que introducir en una base, digamos, en un sistema de información, 4 o 5 variables, que es el nombre de la persona, su cédula de ciudadanía, el delito por el cual fue capturado y va a ser imputado por la fiscalía ante un juez de control de garantías, y la edad de la persona. Eso es todo lo que tiene que incluir y le sale en 4 segundos un PDF, un archivo PDF con toda la hoja de vida, digamos, toda la información de lo que ha pasado con esa persona que está siendo procesada, para que al momento de ir ante el juez de control de garantías realice o no la solicitud de medida de aseguramiento intramural con base en información mucho más objetiva que la que estaban utilizando. Esta herramienta, que en principio puede verse como una herramienta, digamos, de alguna manera peligrosista, como lo conocen los abogados penalistas, es una herramienta que de alguna manera lo que busca es reducir, y acá es donde les voy a contar algo que sale muy importante acá, es reducir el error, lo que en estadística llamamos el error tipo 1 y el error tipo 2, es decir, enviar a prisión preventiva a una persona con bajísimo nivel de riesgo de reincidencia criminal o no enviar a una persona con altísimo nivel de riesgo de reincidencia criminal, que es el error tipo 2. Esto también busca aumentar la eficiencia del sistema de justicia. Jens participó en este artículo, entonces yo creo que va a estar interesado en esto. Reducir la criminalidad sin aumentar los cupos carcelarios y disminuir de alguna manera el número de personas que son enviadas a prisión preventiva. Hay una resistencia particular a la implementación de este tipo de herramientas dicen que la herramienta es peligrosista, pero de alguna manera si la herramienta es peligrosista, el Código Procesal Penal colombiano también lo es, la ley 906, que es una ley procesal, es un Código Procesal Penal, por el contrario de peligrosista, es bastante garantista. Y el artículo que hicimos también está acompañado con un análisis de la constitucionalidad, digamos, del cumplimiento de lo que establece la Constitución para utilizar este tipo de herramientas. Entonces, de alguna manera, algo que puede verse como una herramienta peligrosista puede ayudar mucho a la toma de mejores decisiones en cuanto a disminuir errores tipo 1 y tipo 2, es decir, dejar de enviar personas con bajo nivel de riesgo de reincidencia criminal a prisión preventiva o cometer el error de seguridad, ese es un error de justicia, o cometer un error de seguridad al no privar de la libertad a una persona que tiene objetivamente un altísimo riesgo de reincidencia criminal. Cuando esto es lo que les quería contar, que es muy importante y que es lo que de alguna manera convence a los abogados penalistas de que el uso de estas herramientas, a los abogados penalistas, a los fiscales, a los jueces que no son economistas o no son, digamos, personas que conozcan, hagan un uso frecuente de este tipo de herramientas, y es aquí cuando se convencen. Cuando uno rankea las 7, 8 millones de personas que tenemos en nuestra base de datos en el riesgo de reincidencia criminal que predice el modelo, contra la probabilidad, los grupos de personas, contra la probabilidad de que sean el fiscal solicite la medida de aseguramiento intramural o el juez lo otorgue, nos damos cuenta que prácticamente independiente del riesgo de reincidencia criminal, a todas las personas, independiente de su nivel de riesgo de reincidencia criminal, las están enviando a prisión preventiva prácticamente con la misma probabilidad. Entonces, eso lo que quiere decir es que se están cometiendo muchísimos errores tipo 1, muchísimos errores tipo 2, y que el uso cauteloso y con todos los protocolos que hay que seguir de manejo de información, de que esto no pretende reemplazar a fiscales y jueces, sino complementar su labor, puede de alguna manera no solo disminuir errores tipo 1 y tipo 2, sino también aumentar de manera muy significativa la eficiencia. Nuestros cálculos preliminares dicen que sin enviar una sola persona más, es decir, no enviar más de las 27.000 personas que son enviadas al año a prisión preventiva en Colombia, se puede disminuir la criminalidad, es decir, sin aumentar los cupos carcelarios se puede disminuir más o menos en 29-30% la reincidencia criminal. La otra alternativa de política, como lo muestran Jens y sus coautores en el artículo del Quarterly Journal of Economics, es básicamente con el mismo nivel de reincidencia criminal, utilizando esta herramienta versus no utilizándola, podría disminuirse el uso de prisión preventiva más o menos en un 26%. Es decir, es una herramienta que tiene un potencial muy grande de aumentar la eficiencia del sistema de justicia criminal. Y en este momento la herramienta está diseñada, es operativa, etcétera. En la fiscalía hubo un cambio de alguna manera de administración en la fiscalía y hay unos retrasos en su implementación. Pero yo creo que mi mensaje principal acá es que no debemos tener miedos de utilizar estas herramientas. Lo que debemos hacer es trabajar en los protocolos para el manejo correcto de la información y que sea utilizado de manera correcta. Quiero terminar con esto. Yo creo que hay otras aplicaciones. Yo creo que Jens ha pensado mucho más en este tema, pero Hay otras aplicaciones para este tipo de herramientas o de enlace de las bases de datos de todos los eslabones de la cadena de política criminal. Por ejemplo, en programas de prevención, uno podría argumentar también que el mejor programa de prevención que se haya implementado en el mundo. Acá en Bogotá, cuando yo estuve secretario de Seguridad, implementamos la terapia conductual cognitiva, las cosas más sencillas o menos riesgosas, mal utilizadas también pueden ser un riesgo y podrían filtrarse información que no debe filtrarse, etcétera, etcétera. Otro uso de este tipo de herramientas es para la priorización, para hacer efectivas las órdenes de captura que no han sido materializadas. En Colombia hay cientos de miles de órdenes de captura emitidas por un juez de control de garantías que no han sido materializadas. Entonces, la policía judicial y la policía en general tienen una cantidad impresionante de órdenes de captura que no ha materializado y debería haber una herramienta para priorizar estas órdenes de captura de acuerdo a la peligrosidad, al peligro que representan para la seguridad de las personas que tienen una orden de captura. Y también este tipo de herramientas también se puede utilizar para priorizar o para definir qué herramientas se utilizan con qué individuos. Uno utiliza herramientas, esa es una visión que yo creo que muchos compartimos, en los primeros delitos que una persona comete, cuando está entrando a una carrera criminal, las herramientas deben ser principalmente de prevención, de reescolarización de las personas de los jóvenes que están abandonando el colegio, y se deben hacer todos los intentos para que esas personas puedan, digamos, reingresar a una vida, al colegio, a una vida legal o conseguir un trabajo. Ya cuando una persona, como en el caso colombiano, en el caso mexicano, en el caso de muchos países de la región, es un criminal de carrera, pues seguramente las políticas estrictamente de prevención no funcionan y toca utilizar un poco la fuerza del sistema de justicia criminal para también proteger a la sociedad del riesgo de reincidencia criminal. Y este tipo de herramientas o este tipo de bases de datos que unen los diferentes eslabones de las decisiones de política criminal puede ser utilizada para saber qué herramientas se utilizan con cada individuo. Con esto, Jens, paro acá para seguir a la sección, creo que de preguntas y comentarios.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thanks to all the presenters, not just for the terrific presentations, but for staying fantastically on time, which is great. So now we have plenty of time for Q&A. I wanted to start with two questions that are different versions of the same theme. The first question that I wanted to pose is from, I think, someone in Mexico who says the dark figure of crime in Mexico is very high, exceeding 90%. How much have they been able to promote crime reporting in other latitudes to know the phenomenon better and to clarify these figures? And let me add a friendly amendment to the question, which is not just what are we seeing in terms of the outer limit for how high we can push crime reporting to authorities, but also what do we know, if anything, about what policy levers have been useful for that purpose? So let me open it up to the panel to respond. Daniel, you want to go first?
Sí, gracias. Para responder esa pregunta, dado que la pregunta es para México, en Colombia hace más o menos 3 años, la Policía Nacional y la Fiscalía General de la Nación lanzaron un aplicativo, una app o incluso una página de internet, las dos cosas se pueden hacer, para promover el reporte de delitos contra la propiedad, no delitos contra la vida, no asaltos, ni homicidios, ni delitos sexuales, pero sí el hurto a personas, el hurto a residencias, el hurto a vehículos, y se logró, digamos, un aumento significativo en la tasa de denuncia que reportan las encuestas de victimización en las ciudades donde hay mayor penetración de Internet, es decir, donde hay un mayor uso de Internet o más accesibilidad de uso. Eso funciona muy bien, el aplicativo se llama A Denunciar, lo lanzó la Policía Nacional en conjunto con la Fiscalía General de la Nación, porque una persona se estaba demorando más o menos entre 6 y 8 horas en ir a un sitio a poner una denuncia presencial, y esto pues obviamente prevenía o impedía que la gente denunciara los delitos. Ahora un caveat o una adición a la respuesta, y es que Yo creo que tenemos que empezar a pensar en la región, yo no sé si hay experiencias en otros países del mundo, ajustar las tasas de delitos reportadas con la tasa de denuncia que sale de las encuestas de victimización para tener una cifra, porque la tasa de denuncia fluctúa, tiene unas fluctuaciones muy fuertes en el tiempo, puede pasar del 20 al 40% en cuestión de un año, y hay que ajustar de alguna manera los delitos denunciados por la tasa de denuncia para tener una mejor información sobre cuántos delitos realmente pueden estar ocurriendo.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Let me see if others on the panel would like to respond as well. Yes, Ali, please.
So I sort of, we've had a similar experience to what Daniel is saying. So one of the things that, in Pakistan, they've started to do, as I mentioned, is they've digitized the complaints that are received. So it's not just now FIRs that are being recorded. At least at the police station level, we know what the nature of the complaints are, and through emergency calls for services, people are just calling in and those things are being lodged. But there is a difference between reported crime and complaints. And I think we're also moving towards a system where an e-filing of an FIR is also possible. And if this data starts to get captured, I think sort of access goes up. And we're saying similar things, people are accessing it more. But I think I'd like to caution about two things. One, the issue isn't just how easy it is, but how long it takes for the police to put the complaint into the process. If that becomes costly in terms of time, so you have a complaint, and if the police is just sitting on it for like 2 weeks or 3 weeks to take it to the next step, you get then behaviorally people opting out of the system. So we have to be very, very aware about sort of some streamlining of the process. And there, I think institutional dimensions are important. I already mentioned this kind of South Asia-based, which is very specific to South Asia between FIR and complaints, but we have another distinction in our law in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, which is a distinction between cognizable and non-cognizable offenses. So there are certain offenses on which police can't act without obtaining a warrant from the court. So, gender-based violence, sexual crimes, a lot of these become non-cognizable. And what that does, just that simple institutional rule, it raises the cost of the official system. And people start to drop out. So looking at these kind of dimensions, I think would be really important too.
Terrific, thanks. Aurelie and Edward, do you want to add anything?
Just one very minor point just to close with, which is we do a bit of work in the UK with, I guess, making police complaints more of an operationally useful data source for the police themselves. So we've been finding a lot of complaints coming in kind of unstructured text format, and there are some things you can do around how those get categorized, and again, how you automate that spits out some more useful summaries about like which part of your investigations are attracting more complaints, or are there parts of the service which are struggling more than others, which I'm not sure does very much to increase the overall levels, but maybe helps in terms of the amount of institutional enthusiasm for getting good complaints data in and then making use of it.
Great. Aurelie, anything from you?
No, these were all great comments. And I thought, Ali, when you were showing on your slides examples of what the apps could look like, this seemed like a great, inspiration for others who want to do similar things as well.
Great. Let me ask a follow-up question, which I think is along the same theme, which is, can the panel discuss if we should change the way we think and design crime victimization surveys to overcome the limitations of the traditional data sources as discussed in the different presentations? And so the previous questions had the flavor of what can we do to improve the official data. I think everyone part of this session is aware that there will be limits to how much progress we can make on that dimension. Victim surveys are often viewed as a potentially useful complement. How should the conversation change our thinking about that? So let me turn it over to the panel for responses. Aurelie, do you want to start?
So my first answer is more of a question, which is I'd be really curious to know, how the gap between victimization surveys and official responses changes as we develop new ways to collect this kind of information. So are we learning, if we make it easier for people to bring up complaints, does that mean, is that actually closing this gray number, or is it going to be capturing completely different things that people may not even have thought of as crimes? I think the kinds, Danielle, your example was for property crimes. And I wonder if an app-based system would be the right solution for other crimes that are typically notoriously underreported, such as sexual violence, these kinds of things. And so I was also thinking about how this related to Ali, your example of having different venues for people to report crimes and how the numbers vary between that. So Jens, this is more another question, more food for thought than an answer. I'm not really sure what the answer is, but I think we had on top of this, app-based way to collect crimes, this idea, Ali's presentation was really helpful, that different kinds, the way in which people ask questions, the forms in which, how seriously you think you'll be taken, all these kinds of things could also modify what people are willing to report. And then the gap between victimization surveys and official numbers, if these eventually get included in official numbers.
Great. Others from the panel? Yeah, Daniel.
Gracias, gracias. Dos puntos para contestar un poco la pregunta que hacía Aurelie. En Colombia no se incluyen los delitos sexuales, delitos contra la vida, agresiones o homicidios, obviamente, porque la razón por las que no se incluyeron en este aplicativo de denuncia en línea es que requieren un examen médico-legal para concluir la denuncia. Entonces se interpretó en su momento, cuando se hicieron los grupos focales, se interpretó en su momento como una revictimización de las personas. Es decir, decirles a las personas, pueden denunciar virtualmente, pero al final decirles, tienen que ir a hacerse un examen médico-legal para verificar las lesiones o la agresión sexual, o la autopsia en el caso de familiares de personas que fueron asesinadas. Por eso no se incluyó en el aplicativo. Y ahora con la pregunta inicial de Jens, yo creo que en las encuestas de victimización, voy a hablar de la región de Latinoamérica, que es la experiencia que más conozco, han mejorado sustancialmente, digamos, las encuestas, su cobertura, su representatividad, etcétera. Pero al igual que sucede con muchos comportamientos que la gente no quiere reportar, hace mucha falta que quienes hacen estas encuestas de victimización empiecen a utilizar ciertos tipos de preguntas para desentrañar respuestas verdaderas de temas que las personas no quieren reportar, como por ejemplo los experimentos de lista u otro tipo de mecanismos que se obtienen. Les doy un ejemplo y con esto cierro la respuesta. En Medellín, cuando hicimos la evaluación de impacto de una intervención en puntos calientes de crimen, en hotspots, hicimos una encuesta de victimización utilizando experimentos de lista para saber, a la mitad de las personas les preguntamos si estaban siendo extorsionadas con una pregunta directa, y a la otra mitad le preguntamos, aleatoriamente obviamente, les preguntamos con un experimento de lista si estaba siendo extorsionada. Y las diferencias eran de órdenes de magnitud de las personas que reportaban haber sido extorsionadas en sus negocios locales. Entonces yo creo que hay que moverse en esa dirección, porque hay muchos delitos que la gente no quiere reportar por miedo o por, como decía Aurelie, por ejemplo en delitos sexuales, las mujeres no quieren reportar porque muchas veces su agresor es la misma pareja sentimental.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Ali?
Thanks. One way to sort of take these two answers forward, which I think are really useful, is to, sort of start using, sort of make the surveys more representative, scale up using sort of new technological interfaces. but then start to learn what are the types of victimization that are not getting officially reported, right? We can start to see gaps. And I completely agree with Aurelie's point that it's not sort of just the fact that certain types of complaints are not being reported, but how you enumerate certain types of populations are extremely important. So, you know, a completely different kind of sector or issue. We did a big experiment about a couple of years ago on women's political participation. Which is just to encourage women to participate with sort of civil society organizations. And, you know, women's responses were highly they kind of differentiated between who came to canvass them. So if men came, it was a completely different business from if women came to ask them questions. So we have to kind of see who's also going to be asking the questions, how impersonal or personal you want to make that particular type of process. The last thing I'd say is that, you know, we're talking about two different worlds. I was actually in the Inspector General of Police's office for 6 hours this morning, you know, sort of having a conversation. What the police thinks of as crime is a very legal way of thinking. You know, if you kind of ask me, and I worked on this for about 10 years, I've also been a victim of various kinds of thefts and robberies and so on in my life. But I don't think of those incidents in the same way. I can't sort of make a distinction between theft and burglary, what's robbery, right? But in the legal infrastructure, those things make a lot of difference. So also crime victimization service give you the opportunity to match the two things. And really, they'll give you insights about how to sort of make the gap between the official way of thinking and the citizens' way of thinking. How do you close that gap? That becomes a very important issue as far as I'm concerned.
Terrific. Thanks, Ali. Edward, do you want to add anything?
Just briefly, and I guess this is not a solution to the problem posed by the questioner, but something that we've been having a lot of discussions about in the UK has been, as well as the sort of the individual citizen victim situations where you've got kind of companies and third parties who have a lot of information about crime rates. I think we're particularly seeing sort of quite anecdotally a big increase in fraud and online fraud in the UK recently that's not necessarily being picked up by those statistics. And so a big challenge is the banks have very good data on it, but for sort of obvious reasons are reluctant to share it. You don't want to be the bank that is the hotspot for fraud. And we've seen similar dynamics with mobile phone theft and vehicle crime, where insurers have fantastic data. And I mean, often there's a link there because you need a police report to get your insurance paid out. But yeah, where this data is not necessarily flowing through. And it's both a question there of just, do we know what's going on with these issues? But it's also, there's a kind of consumer angle to it of probably the consumer deserves to know if there are particular mobile phone brands that are more risky or particular vehicle types that are being stolen more often. So we've been doing some work, which is very difficult and takes a lot of time to do, but of publicizing some of that data. But I don't think we've at all got the answer yet in terms of fraud and how that gets captured, and yeah, how we start connecting those data sets in a way that gives us a really good picture of what's going on.
Let me just add thank you, Edward. Let me just add one quick point to build on a point that Ali made, which is, so a lot of the panel responses have the flavor of, or many of them have the flavor of how you think about getting people to respond honestly and accurately, or at least in response to the conceptual idea that you're trying to get at. But I also wanted to build a little bit on Ali's point about the importance of the representativeness of the data. The United States gets something like a 90 to 95% response rate to the National Crime Victimization Survey, which I think most of us would think of as the gold standard for a response rate for a survey. But my friend Philip Cook at Duke many years ago wrote a paper showing that even with response rates on the order of 90 to 95%, these victimization surveys systematically underrepresent the populations that are at greatest risk for gun violence and serious violence victimization. And the reason that I wanted to mention that for policy planning purposes is if you've never been involved in doing or supporting a survey before, I think one of the most non-intuitive features of survey work is how much the marginal cost per completed survey increases as the response rate increases. If you are happy to do a survey with a 20% response rate, the marginal and the average cost of the completed survey responses can be very tolerable. If you want something that has a 90 to 95% response rate, it's a totally different cost proposition. And I wanted to just say that out loud to everybody who's part of this so that on the policymaker planning side, we all understand the resource commitment that would be required to achieve the point that Aurelie made, which I wholeheartedly wanted to endorse, which is the enormous importance of making sure that the survey response set that we get really are representative of the populations that we want to capture. Let me turn to the next question then, which is it possible to use social media data like Twitter to complement official data? I don't know if anyone on the panel has thoughts about that. Yep, Aurelie, please.
At least in our context, I'd be very reluctant to go down that route because it's highly, highly selected. And I think for another reason that in at least what I've seen here, policymakers are very, very over-responsive to Twitter to start off with. So if that becomes a standard data source, then I think we're going to create unintended consequences, which are going to be quite dire.
Great, thank you. Does anyone want to add anything? Edward, yes.
I think firstly, Alex is exactly right in terms of what you would want to extrapolate from social media data. There are some things that I've seen and that we've done in terms of, I guess, just within social media, trying to run experiments and try and sort of change behavior on social media platforms. So there's a great paper with a very memorable title. I think it's Tweetment Effect on the Tweeted, looking at trying to reduce the amount of racial harassment going on Twitter and doing this great design where you just reply to people's tweets, and they have a great factorial design where they compare a few different sort of types of repliers in terms of their sort of social status and race. And yeah, we're quite interested in, I guess, things on those platforms where you can do those interventions, but I wouldn't want to claim much more than that those are reducing the amount of harassment on that platform rather than necessarily having wider social consequences.
Great, thanks, Edward. Yeah, Aurelie.
If I can build off a little bit on this, I think kind of like, I agree with Ali that I would be worried if this became like an official source. I guess this can be helpful back to the prior conversation as a diagnostics tool to see maybe things that may not be accurately captured, but that people are raising as concerns. And in particular, I think, in terms of harms from police officers, Twitter was a place where this became a more salient issue and, kind of led policymakers to think about whether they could develop tools to, capture this in a better way. So perhaps as a diagnostics tool, rather than a ground truth, this could be helpful for policymakers.
Great, terrific. Let me see, the next question I have in the queue is for Daniel. Question about whether you could provide the audience with a little bit more visibility on the tool that's being used. What sorts of questions are being asked? Is it similar to public safety assessments or criminogenic risk assessments, like the level of service inventory revised?
Gracias. La herramienta básicamente, Jens, replica el artículo que tú publicaste con coautores en QJE. Ustedes lo hicieron con datos de Nueva York para failure to appear in court. Nosotros lo hicimos para el riesgo de reincidencia criminal, la proyección del riesgo de reincidencia criminal. Y lo que se hace acá para contestar la pregunta es básicamente utilizar a nivel individual el historial criminal de las personas, el historial criminal en los diferentes, digamos, los datos que tenemos en cada eslabón del sistema de justicia criminal, para hacer una predicción del riesgo de reincidencia criminal utilizando herramientas de Machine Learning. Muy similar a las herramientas que ustedes, Jens, utilizaron en el artículo de QJE. que fue hecho para Nueva York. Acá es hecho con todos los datos de Colombia, con un objetivo distinto que no es predecir el failure to appear in court, el riesgo de no aparecer, digamos, en las audiencias, sino para predecir el riesgo de reincidencia criminal. Digamos, cuando uno compara las métricas de la predicción y por qué no se utiliza acá econometría, sino herramientas de aprendizaje de máquinas o machine learning, es básicamente porque las herramientas de machine learning permiten capturar mucho mejor no linealidades en ciertas variables que son determinantes a la hora de predecir el riesgo de reincidencia criminal. Es básicamente una réplica para una pregunta diferente, y la pregunta principal es puntualmente cuál es el riesgo de reincidencia criminal que predice un modelo para una persona que ha sido capturada y está siendo imputada por la Fiscalía General de la Nación. Esto no, lo quiero decir muy enfáticamente, no pretende de ninguna manera reemplazar el papel y el rol que juegan los fiscales o los jueces de control de garantías al solicitar u otorgar la medida de aseguramiento intramural. Lo que quiere hacer es básicamente que los fiscales y los jueces de control de garantías, a la hora de tomar esta decisión, tengan mayor información para evaluar objetivamente cuál es el riesgo de reincidencia criminal de una persona a la cual se le está solicitando o no se le está solicitando la medida de aseguramiento intramural, que es básicamente una decisión que limita una libertad individual y que es muy peligroso tomarla mal. Tomarla mal porque está poniéndose en juego no solo la libertad de la persona, si la persona tiene un bajo nivel de riesgo de reincidencia criminal, o si lo tiene o no lo tiene, no importa, sino también el riesgo para las víctimas directas de esa persona o para la comunidad de que esa persona reincida en delitos. Entonces la pregunta, digamos, una pregunta de policy es, ¿cómo mejoramos la información que tienen las personas que toman las decisiones, fiscales y jueces, para que se cometan menos errores y se aumente la eficiencia de los objetivos de política, que es disminuir la reincidencia criminal y disminuir también el número de personas que son enviadas a prisión preventiva?
Sorry, Aurelie, go ahead. I'm sorry, I was on mute.
I just wanted to build off a little bit, but just raise a tangential point, which isn't about how the tool is used, but as it relates to kind of like the theme of this panel, which is data and behavioral science. I do want to note for everybody here that another, I think, important question which we don't have good answers to is how and when are judges using these tools? And I think there are a few recent papers, in particular by Megan Stevenson, that suggest that, judges and other decision makers are kind of maybe at first using them and then not using them. So as we think, I saw another question, which is about equity and fairness and whether there would be equity and fairness questions. I think even the simple usage question will be really important to explore and answer, and kind of reminding me of a broader point, which is, as we develop data infrastructures and as we start to push out information to different criminal justice / legal decision makers, this could be also, your example, Daniel, was providing decision makers with risk assessments. But if there are other issues of, criminal justice policy, equity that we want to help legal decision makers with, then we could think of other tools than risk assessment as well. So 2 points: A, we need to think about how these risk assessments are being used, and B, more generally, now that we're providing information, we could potentially use nudges to change other decisions through other mechanisms than risk assessments.
Yeah, Daniel, let me give you a brief moment for a quick follow-up, and then we'll wrap up.
Yo creo que, Aurelie, tienes toda la razón, y por eso nosotros diseñamos la herramienta. Luego hicimos un piloto con 10 fiscales durante más o menos un mes y medio, y hubo una buena, digamos, aceptación de la herramienta. Los fiscales, a pesar de, digamos, de no estar familiarizados con este tipo de herramientas estadísticas, etcétera, la asumieron bien, pero por eso queríamos hacerla, por las preguntas que tú planteas, era que queríamos hacer la evaluación de impacto, no solo para mirar cuánto disminuía el riesgo de la reincidencia criminal ex post tras el uso de la herramienta, había un grupo de control con el cual no se hubiera utilizado la herramienta, sino también para mirar cuándo la utilizaban, si la utilizaban selectivamente para ciertos capturados por raza, por género, por tipo de delito, etc. Desafortunadamente, la evaluación de impacto está en este momento estancada porque la nueva administración de la Fiscalía no ha querido implementarla.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks to all the panelists. This was a terrific session. There was one last question for Daniel, which we won't have time to get into, but I want to mention the question because I think it's relevant for the data theme, which is there was a question about how Daniel linked the different data sources together. And I wanted to just mention the question because I think it's very easy to assume that the data linking will always be straightforward and mechanical. And what I think those of us who work in this area realize that probabilistic matching by things like name and date of birth are enormously difficult. And I think increased attention to having standard identifiers across data systems is enormously important. I wanted to put that on the table. Let me just try and say back what I think are some of the key themes that I think that I heard over the presentation. Again, the theme of the larger panel was behavioral science and data in the area of crime and criminal justice. And I think the starting place for many of us when we think about this larger topic is to start with the behavioral science of this and think that the progress is really that most of the work and the progress is going to come from getting the psychology right. And I think one recurring theme that you saw through all of the presentations and in the Q&A is that the data will be at least as important. And I think that I heard 4 different categories of data infrastructure and data use that'll be very important for using behavioral science to make progress. And one that the speakers mentioned is the importance of data for correctly diagnosing the nature of the problems that we're trying to solve. Another theme that I heard was data as intervention itself, using the data to reflect back information and guide policy decisions. A third category of data importance for behavioral science that I heard was data as a key delivery vehicle for the intervention. And the example here was the one that Aurelie pointed to, which is lacking information on cell phone numbers for people makes delivery of the intervention difficult. And the final category that I wanted to mention was I think this is implicit in all the presentations as well, the importance of high quality data infrastructure for measurement of progress. Progress in our policy innovations and interventions isn't possible without having good feedback from the world about whether we are making conditions better or worse. So my enormous thanks to the panelists. I thought it was an absolutely terrific panel. And thanks to the audience for participating. And let me turn it over to Louisa to wrap up then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jens, for your swift moderation, and also to our amazing panelists. It's a great way to start this conference. Thank you so much. Con esto cerramos la primera sesión del día. Mis colegas compartirán en el chat una liga para que nos ayuden a evaluar esta sesión, así como registrar su asistencia a la misma. Para obtener el certificado, les recuerdo que deberán asistir a por lo menos el 60% de las sesiones, por eso es súper importante que nos regalen unos minutos de su tiempo para contestarla. Tendremos un breve receso de 14 minutos para que vayan por café, por agua o una botana, ¿por qué no? Y les esperamos en la siguiente sesión en punto de las 11:30 de la mañana, hora Ciudad de México. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias por formar parte de los primeros 10 años del Centro de Excelencia UNODC-INEGI. Nacimos en 2011 con el propósito de fortalecer las capacidades estadísticas en América Latina y el Caribe. Apoyamos a los países a generar y a utilizar datos de calidad siguiendo los estándares estadísticos internacionales sobre delincuencia y justicia penal. Durante estos años, hemos realizado 4 conferencias internacionales sobre estadísticas de gobernanza, seguridad y justicia para promover la generación y el intercambio de conocimiento a nivel regional e internacional. Hemos impulsado el desarrollo de encuestas de victimización en 13 países con una metodología estandarizada y aprobada por toda la región. La Iniciativa para Encuesta de Victimización Delictiva en Latinoamérica y el Caribe, BICLAC. Hemos colaborado en la definición de estándares como la Clasificación Internacional de Delitos para fines estadísticos, el lineamiento internacional más importante para el registro, clasificación y medición del delito. Hemos organizado 7 concursos internacionales de tesis, impulsando a jóvenes universitarios a utilizar las estadísticas delictivas y las técnicas de investigación académica más novedosas. El Centro de Excelencia es la Secretaría Técnica del Grupo de Trabajo sobre Estadísticas de Seguridad y Justicia de la Conferencia Estadística de las Américas de la CEPAL. Con el esfuerzo y la guía de nuestros principales socios, hemos tenido avances importantes en la medición del crimen organizado, la corrupción, la victimización de empresas, la ciberdelincuencia, el acoso sexual y la tenencia de armas de fuego. Hemos contribuido a evaluar la calidad estadística en 6 países, siguiendo los principios fundamentales de las estadísticas oficiales. Hemos capacitado a más de 2,000 servidores públicos dentro y fuera de la región, tanto en talleres presenciales como en cursos virtuales, para fortalecer sus capacidades para medir el delito. Además de brindar pláticas y conferencias de forma ininterrumpida desde nuestra creación. En estos 10 años, hemos trabajado en 29 países de la región y hemos visto que hace falta mucho por hacer. El mundo está cambiando y nosotros también. Miramos hacia adelante con una convicción. Con datos podemos medir y visibilizar los retos de seguridad que tenemos enfrente. Usemos los datos para prevenir la delincuencia y combatir al crimen organizado.